Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The early morning air was crisp and damp as Ada stepped out of her black SUV and stared at the humble countryside church nestled between two mango trees. It wasn't a place marked by grandeur or fame, but something about the simplicity of its whitewashed walls and cracked tiled steps spoke to her broken soul. For months, she had carried the weight of betrayal, grief, and near death like heavy sacks of flour pressing down on her chest. She needed release, not from her business, not from her image, but from the part of herself that had grown bitter and afraid. As she stepped into the church, the scent of old wood and candle wax greeted her like an old friend. There were no worshippers inside, only a caretaker sweeping the pews who quietly nodded and left her alone. Ada walked slowly toward the altar, her eyes fixed on the large wooden cross. Her legs trembled beneath her as she dropped to her knees, clasped her hands, and finally allowed her tears to flow. Her cries echoed softly through the empty sanctuary, muffled by the stained glass windows above. She didn't have fancy words or rehearsed prayers, just raw pain spilling from her soul. "God," she whispered, choking on emotion, "I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. I've built something, lost everything, rebuilt again, and I'm still here, but I feel like I'm dying inside." Her voice quivered as she poured out years of trauma, from the mocking on the roadside as a bread seller, to Linda's betrayal, to Raymond's fake love, to nearly losing her parents. She spoke of how her kindness was mistaken for weakness, and how her search for love almost destroyed her empire. "I don't want to fight anymore. I just want peace. I want to be wise. I want to lead with strength and kindness, not desperation." For nearly an hour, she remained on her knees, whispering pain and asking for direction. And as the morning sun began to shine through the stained glass, casting colorful patterns across her face, Ada felt a strange peace. Not because all her problems had vanished, but because something inside her had shifted. Her tears dried not out of satisfaction, but out of surrender. When she rose to her feet, her knees ached, but her spirit was light. Ada walked out of that church with a quiet resolve and a new kind of strength. The woman who had once cried alone in her bakery's storeroom, betrayed and heartbroken, was now embracing her journey with full awareness. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was leading with purpose. As her car pulled away from the church compound, Ada didn't look back. She opened her phone and drafted a message to Felix. "Thank you for staying. I'm back now fully." She also typed another name, Linda. But she paused and stared at it, then deleted the message. That conversation would need to happen face to face. With the engine humming and the road before her long and winding, Ada leaned back and whispered again, "God, help me trust again, but this time only where you lead." Returning to Lagos wasn't just a change in location. It was a declaration of war. But this time, Ada wasn't entering the battlefield with bleeding wounds or desperate hope. She arrived with a journal full of strategies, a lawyer by her side, and a boardroom filled with cautious but loyal staff. The first order of business was a full internal audit. Every branch, every vendor, every department head was placed under careful review. Felix, ever meticulous, helped Ada set up a legal firewall around her bakery brand. They began with loyalty tests, quietly replacing anyone who showed signs of double dealing. The cleanup wasn't pretty. Several top staff who had once enjoyed Ada's blind trust were shown the door. Anonymous exit letters revealed how deep the rot had once run. Fake ingredient orders, inflated supply invoices, and even under-the-table bribes. Ada read them with no emotion. She had cried enough. Now she was rebuilding, this time on granite, not sand. She worked late into the night, often the last to leave the headquarters. She changed internal protocols. No single person could sign off on major transactions. She digitized every inventory channel and installed hidden quality checks across all her branches. Whenever she visited a bakery outlet unannounced, the staff trembled, not because she was cruel, but because they knew she was watching. Felix often reminded her, "You're not the same woman anymore, Ada." She would nod, but inwardly she knew. She was wiser, yes, but also scarred. Every new staff member underwent orientation personally overseen by her assistant, and Ada made sure her story, the real one, was told to every new team. The betrayal, the downfall, the rise. It wasn't just policy, it was culture. Her bakery wasn't just selling bread, it was selling resilience. The public, still uncertain after the Raymond scandal, began to see a new Ada through her actions. She didn't grant interviews or seek sympathy. Instead, she quietly increased production quality, ensured prompt deliveries, and supported local bread sellers again, the same group she once belonged to. Sales climbed, not because of PR, but because trust returned. Loyal customers posted photos of Ada's loaves with hashtags like #BakedBySurvival and #BreadOfGrace. Ada took no pride in the noise, only in the system she'd built. It wasn't about praise anymore. It was about never falling for the same traps again. She created an empire guarded by principle, not personality. And deep inside, she knew something else. Peace was the greatest crown she could ever wear. It took Ada a full week before she finally placed a call to Linda. The number rang twice before the familiar voice answered, timid yet steady. Hello. There was a pause before Ada replied. It's me, Ada. I was hoping we could meet. Just for peace. Linda didn't respond for a full 10 seconds, then simply said, name the time and place. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe far from the city's eyes, a place neither of them had history with neutral ground. When Ada arrived, she found Linda already seated, dressed modestly and holding a cheap notebook. The moment their eyes met, there was no tension, only weariness. They didn't hug or cry. They just nodded. After ordering tea, Ada went straight to the point. You saved my life. I know that now, and I want to thank you properly. Linda looked down, biting her lip. I didn't do it for thanks, she murmured. I didn't want to be the reason you died. I've done terrible things, Ada, but murder wasn't one of them. The silence between them grew heavy, but Ada didn't flinch. I know, she said. That's why I want to offer something. Not as guilt payment, but as a return for the life you helped me keep. Ada then pulled out a slim file from her bag, a proposal to help Linda open a boutique in a different state, fully funded, legally protected, and branded with her own name. I want you to be independent. I want us to have peace, real peace. But I also want us to stay apart professionally. This is not competition. This is closure. Linda's eyes watered, but she didn't reach for a tissue. She simply nodded, whispering, thank you. I'll take it, and I'll do better this time. They left the cafe, without ceremony. No cameras, no witnesses. Just two women who had once loved and hated each other more than anyone else. As they walked toward their separate cars, Ada paused and called out, Linda. The woman turned around. If anyone tries to harm me again, I'll fight. I won't fall next time. Linda smiled, a soft, almost proud smile. I believe you. You're not the Ada I used to know. And with that, they turned and walked away in opposite directions. Not as friends. Not as enemies. Just as women who had finally laid the past to rest. Ngozi arrived like perfume in a storm, elegant, composed, and dangerously charming. She wasn't just a socialite. She was a power broker, a woman who made things happen behind polished nails and calculated smiles. She had heard of Ada's rising influence in the baking industry, and unlike others who saw a girl who rose from the roadside, Ngozi saw competition that had to be stopped. Her presence at Ada's quiet product launch event wasn't accidental. She wore a crimson gown and approached with a honeyed voice, introducing herself as a supporter of women-led businesses. But behind her eyes, her mission was clear. Ada felt it, but didn't react. She had grown too wise to confront poison with panic. Instead, she smiled back, took her card, and watched her walk away. What Ada didn't know was that Ngozi had already begun forging partnerships with one of Ada's disgruntled ex-investors, someone who lost influence after Felix and Ada restructured the board months ago. Ngozi's plot wasn't loud or brash. It was sophisticated. She arranged meetings with government food inspectors, backdoor suppliers, and media influencers. She funded a competitor bakery chain that mimicked Ada's signature product style, but sold at lower prices. When that didn't dent Ada's clientele, she took the game further. Through her contacts, she managed to push low-grade flour into Ada's logistics stream, making it look like internal mismanagement. A week after distribution, complaints started surfacing online. Customers shared pictures of moldy bread, bad taste, and allergic reactions. Ada's team was confused. Quality control had been tight. It didn't take long for the media to latch on. Headlines screamed as the bread queen lost her touch, and what happened to Ada's bakery? Her competitors and enemies rejoiced, but Ada stayed unusually quiet. She told her staff, "Let them talk. The truth is in the flour, not the noise." What they didn't know was that Ada had built a mirror logistics trail after the last attack from Raymond. Felix had helped her install a whistleblower program and planted legal trackers in all transactions. With every false accusation, Ngozi dug deeper into a trap Ada was already preparing. But Ada wasn't interested in exposing her yet. She needed to understand how deep Ngozi's tentacles ran, how many enemies sat around her in friendly faces. Ada stood at the window of her office one rainy evening, watching her staff move around the bakery floor. Her mother was in the village, recovering. Her father now walked with a limp after the kidnapping. The weight was heavy, but this time she stood firm. The new attack wasn't just about bread. It was a war to silence her legacy. But Ada wasn't that young girl they mocked anymore. She was building something worth defending, even if it cost her more scars. It started with a single signature, an unexpected supply contract signed by one of Ada's lower procurement officers. The flour delivery matched all certifications, passed preliminary tests, and even arrived with glowing reviews from inspectors. But something was off. The texture during baking was inconsistent. The loaves didn't rise the same. Ada noticed it during her personal midnight bake, a ritual she returned to whenever things fell off. She called Felix the next morning and said, "I need that batch traced. Every single bag." The legal team began an audit, and what they found was chilling. The flour wasn't from their official suppliers. The documents had been forged, and the name of the supposed quality inspector had been dead for 5 years. It was a perfectly planted fraud, with just enough truth to pass surface scrutiny. The legal team suspected sabotage, but Ada was already ahead. She quietly replaced the remaining stock and recalled every delivery. Customers were offered refunds with apology notes and fresh loaves. Ngozi was furious. She had expected outrage, resignations, and a dip in stock value. Instead, Ada's bakery chain released a calm video with Ada kneading dough, explaining the recall and thanking her customers for their patience. Her poise turned backlash into admiration. But Ada wasn't done. She summoned all her procurement staff to a weekend retreat. No excuses. Phones off. Felix conducted a discreet investigation there, and 2 staff members confessed they had been bribed to sign and receive the bad flour. Ada didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just removed them quietly and said, "You were willing to poison children for a paycheck. I can't fix that kind of hunger." The moment shook her staff to the core. From that day, loyalty wasn't expected, it was earned. Ada's grace under fire inspired reverence and fear. But Ngozi wasn't done either. She turned her focus to Ada's investors, planting whispers that Ada's grace was just marketing, and that she used sympathy to cover her crumbling empire. She pushed fake blog articles about secret lovers funding Ada's expansion, and hinted at Felix being the real owner behind the scenes. When one article claimed Ada had faked her poisoning for publicity, Felix brought the media house to court. Ada didn't show up at the hearing. She didn't need to. Her silence was the strategy. In private, she told Felix, "The more I talk, the more they twist. But the more I bake, the more people taste the truth." That week, her sales surged again. The country didn't just trust her product, they trusted her resilience. Still, deep inside, Ada knew this wasn't over. Ngozi's silence now was more dangerous than her noise. Something bigger was coming, and it wouldn't be a media storm. Felix had always been calm, but this time he was visibly rattled. "She's targeting your roots now," he told Ada, sliding a file across her table. Inside were digital bank transfers, linking Ngozi to one of Ada's longtime board members, and a known corrupt inspector from the National Food Quality Board. The same man who had once demanded bribes during Ada's early days. Ada clenched her jaw. So she's trying to break me from inside. Felix nodded. And she's good at it. Elegant. Quiet. She uses people like weapons. Ada stared at the file for a long time, then stood and walked to her office window. Outside, the bakery delivery vans were being loaded. She watched a young staff member help a grandmother carry loaves to her car. Felix, she said softly, if I don't fight this now, I'll be remembered for what they made up, not what I built. The legal strike came in waves. Felix filed for criminal interference against the flour suppliers, naming them and the corrupted inspector publicly. Ada's team released packaging evidence and audit footage online. Felix's assistant uncovered a chain of shell companies linking back to one of Ngozi's former fashion houses, a cover for money laundering. When it hit the press, Ngozi denied everything, called it defamatory theatrics, and accused Ada of using her as a scapegoat. But Ada didn't respond. She focused on rebuilding trust. She hosted a press-free community baking session with widows and single mothers, streamed live, but not for PR, just to do good again. The people noticed. Investors who had once pulled out now began to send quiet emails of support. But the pressure didn't end there. Ngozi, knowing her political connections were now exposed, began stirring civil accusations. She filed a lawsuit claiming Ada's training center used unlicensed techniques, and that her bakery violated zoning laws. It was a desperate move, but dangerous. Felix responded with fire. He brought in government partners Ada had worked with on women empowerment. They testified in Ada's favor. The zoning complaints were proven fabricated. And by the end of the month, Ngozi's lawyer was arrested for submitting falsified documents. Felix walked into Ada's office after that final victory, eyes weary but determined. One battle down, he said. Ada simply nodded and whispered, let's see what they try next. But this time, she wasn't trembling. Her armor was forged, not from power, but from pain that had taught her how to lead without falling. Ada sat at the balcony of her Lagos home that evening, sipping a cup of hot millet pap her mother used to make for her as a child. Her thoughts weren't on bread, profits, or legal fires. They were on the sudden silence she'd noticed from her parents. For 3 days, their calls had been oddly brief. Her father, who used to laugh loudly and complain about mosquitoes in the village, now answered like someone being watched. Her mother, usually warm and quick with prayerful blessings, seemed to whisper her goodbyes too quickly. Ada's instincts, sharp from trauma and betrayal, began to burn with warning. That night, she sent Felix a message. Can we check in on my parents, please? Something feels wrong. Felix, always attentive, promised to dispatch a private investigator quietly without alerting the authorities. By morning, what they uncovered turned Ada's blood cold. Strange visitors had been seen around her parents' home in the past week. Unfamiliar men pretending to sell items or ask for directions. And then came the phone call. It wasn't a typical ransom call. It was calculated and terrifyingly calm. A woman's voice, chillingly elegant, spoke clearly. Shut down your bakery for 3 weeks. Say it's for renovations, or you'll never see your parents again. Then the line went dead. Ada collapsed onto her knees, phone trembling in her hands. All the strength she had rebuilt, all the armor she had forged, cracked in that moment. Memories of her mother cheering her on from the side of the road, her father kneeling to pray when she first got her bakery license. They flashed like lightning. Ada hadn't cried in months. But now, curled on her kitchen floor, she let the tears come. Felix arrived less than an hour later. He didn't speak. He simply knelt beside her and held her. His shirt soaked her pain silently. Ada whispered through tears, I can't lose them. I can't. And Felix replied softly, then we'll fight like never before. They began a quiet lockdown. Ada announced a 1-week strategic break for staff training. She and Felix operated from a hidden guest house, while a trusted security team discreetly watched over her home and office. Felix's eyes, once calm, now carried a fire Ada hadn't seen before. He worked through the night, tracing the ransom call, contacting a few trusted friends in high government security, people who owed him favors from past legal battles. One name kept popping up from surveillance: Ngozi. While they had legally cornered her, her social reach still had dangerous depths. But this time, she wasn't working alone. There was another unseen figure behind the scenes, someone who knew how to orchestrate without exposure. Felix leaned across the table late into the night and told Ada, "We're dealing with something darker now. This isn't just competition. This is war." Ada clenched her jaw, nodded slowly, and replied, "Then let them come. But this time I'm ready." The next day, the storm arrived. Despite all their precautions, Ada's parents were taken. The small village house was empty when her uncle visited. Doors flung open, teacups unwashed, the old transistor radio still playing in the background. But the couple was gone. There was no sign of struggle, only silence, and a scrap of paper left on the bed. "Don't test us." When Ada received the news, she didn't scream. She didn't faint. Instead, she stood in the center of the room and whispered, "It has begun." The pain didn't cripple her this time. It fueled her. With Felix at her side, they activated the hidden government contact he had been working with, a high-ranking official named Chief Daramola, a man who owed Felix his freedom from a past corruption scandal. Daramola agreed to help under one condition: total secrecy. If word got out, the abductors would disappear into thin air. Ada agreed. Every day after that became a silent march through hell. They watched every second, every transaction, every surveillance feed. Felix worked like a man possessed, tracking every bribe, every whisper, every movement from Ngozi's circle. But this time, something even more troubling surfaced. There was a name repeatedly mentioned by paid informants: Mrs. K, a wealthy matron and underground fixer who was said to fund vendettas for sport. Felix's friend in internal security confirmed that Mrs. K was now backing Ngozi, and was likely the one who ordered the abduction. Ada barely slept. She sat in the corner of the guest house most nights, staring at her parents' photo, whispering their names over and over. "Please be alive," she said one night as the generator hummed quietly. "Please just be alive." And then came the call. This time it was a man's voice, calm, young, and polished. "This is your final warning, Ada. Shut down your entire business chain, or your parents disappear into air." Ada's lips trembled. "I will not trade my life's work for fear," she whispered. "Then prepare their caskets," the voice replied, and the line went dead. But they weren't prepared for Ada's next move. She turned to Felix and said, "Send the files. Every bribe, every transaction, every evidence you've collected. Give it to Daramola now. We won't wait. We strike first." Within hours, a secret government task force moved on locations across 3 states, storming illegal safe houses tied to Mrs. K. That night, while Ada knelt again in prayer, Felix entered the room quietly. His voice cracked. "We found them. Your parents. They're alive. Weak but alive." Ada broke into sobs and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she wept. But Felix only whispered, "It's not me, Ada. It's the God you never stopped calling." The morning sun cast long golden rays into the hospital room where Ada's parents lay recovering. Her father, thin and weary, gripped her hand and said, "We knew you would come." Her mother, voice hoarse from fear, smiled through tears. "God never forgot us." Ada wept as she kissed their foreheads. She had fought wars for bread, reputation, and survival. But this battle for her parents left the deepest wound. And yet, there beside her, every step, was Felix. He never left. Not once. When Ada collapsed from exhaustion, he lifted her. When she lost hope, he prayed beside her. When fear whispered lies, he countered it with truth. That week, as they stayed close to the hospital, Ada saw him. Not as a lawyer, not as a protector, but as the only man who had ever stood with her for nothing in return. They took quiet walks outside the hospital grounds when she needed to clear her head. One day, beneath an old mango tree, she asked, "Why didn't you leave like the others?" Felix smiled. "Because I knew who you were before you became the woman they fear. And because I never wanted your crown, only to shield it. Ada stared at him, her chest tightening with emotions she had long buried. Love, she had learned, was not a grand performance. It was quiet, sacrificial, and unshakable. She reached out, touched his hand, and said, "I've been so afraid. I lost myself to false love before." Felix looked into her eyes and replied, "Then let me prove that I came not to own you, but to walk beside you. Let me earn your trust again and again." Ada didn't respond immediately. She just smiled, a fragile, hopeful smile. The kind that wasn't forged in romance, but in war. Back at the bakery, things resumed slowly. Staff returned, production restarted, and suppliers pledged allegiance once more. But Ada no longer moved like a lone queen. Now she built council, not just workers, but protectors, visionaries, and truth-tellers. She created a second-in-command structure that could survive without her if needed. Felix oversaw legal divisions and strategy, but Ada still handled the ovens, the products, and the vision. In a board meeting, she stood up and said, "I'm not building bread anymore. I'm building legacy. And this time, no one will touch it again." The room rose in a standing ovation. But it was Felix, watching from the corner, who smiled with silent pride. He didn't need her spotlight. Her strength was enough light for both of them. And deep in Ada's heart, something had changed. She was no longer the girl who begged for love. She had become the woman who chose who was worthy to walk beside her. Night blanketed the city in silence as the covert rescue plan moved into motion. The government task force, led discreetly through Felix's connections, tracked the kidnappers to a dilapidated compound on the outskirts of Ogun State. Ada, though shaken and visibly pale, sat still inside the operations van with headphones on, hearing the muffled radio updates. Her heart raced with every whispered command from the team. Hold, eyes on target, go. It wasn't just her parents inside that compound. It was the last thread of peace she had left. Her bakery could be rebuilt, her image could be repaired, but if they harmed her parents, Ada knew she might never recover. Yet she didn't cry. Not tonight. With trembling hands clutched together and silent lips moving in prayer, she focused only on one thing, bringing them home. The operation lasted barely 15 minutes. The armed guards protecting the kidnappers took the bait of a fake delivery van, and within seconds, they were subdued by the silent force that swarmed the compound. Ada watched it unfold through the van's small surveillance screen, masked agents storming in, room by room, until a frantic voice on the radio finally whispered, "We have them. They're alive." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she did not sob. Instead, she pressed both palms to her lips and shut her eyes tightly. Her mother's name was called, then her father's. Their faces flashed briefly across the camera, pale, shaken, but breathing. She collapsed into Felix's arms the moment the van turned toward the safe house. Her whispers were barely audible. "Thank you, God, thank you." Hours later, in a hidden location provided by government security, Ada finally saw them again. Her mother's weak arms wrapped around her tightly, and her father, despite bruises and tears, smiled with trembling lips. "You're stronger than all of us," he whispered. Ada wanted to break down and weep, but she remained composed. She bathed her mother, dressed her father's wounds, and kissed their foreheads, one after the other. Then she turned to Felix. He had not slept. He had not eaten. And still, he stood beside her with fire in his eyes. For the first time, Ada reached for his hand, not as a business partner, not as a lawyer, but as someone who had walked through her darkest valley and refused to let go. "You saved them," she said, her voice cracking. "No," he replied, his eyes steady. "We did. Because I believe in your crown more than anyone ever has." The morning after the rescue, Ada sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching the drip chamber rhythmically feed life back into the woman who once sold groundnuts to keep her in school. Her father dozed in the next room, a slight snore his only betrayal of peace after trauma. For hours, Ada didn't move. She sat with her head bowed, her fingers clasped over her lap. The image of their weak bodies and sunken faces haunted her. The bread empire she had built had cost too much, her heart, her peace, and nearly her family. Her mother stirred beside her and whispered hoarsely, You've always carried too much for one child. Ada tried to smile, but her lips quivered. She wiped a tear and leaned forward. I'm not that child anymore. I'm something else now. Outside the hospital, press vans waited like vultures, but Ada ignored them all. She didn't make a public statement. She didn't host a press conference. She focused only on ensuring her parents recovered while quietly moving her company's operations back online. Felix ensured the kidnappers were prosecuted, and within days, Ngozi's connection to the criminals was uncovered and leaked anonymously. Bank transactions, phone logs, hidden messages. Felix's legal fire scorched every dark corner. The media flipped like a switch. Headlines read, "Bread Queen targeted by political sabotage." And public sympathy flooded Ada's way. But she didn't gloat. Instead, she walked into her bakery headquarters 1 week later with no makeup, no security, and flour stains already on her skirt. Her staff rose. Her managers stood tall. And Ada simply nodded. Let's start again. But something shifted inside her. Ada, once warm and trusting, became calculating. She no longer waited for the next betrayal. She anticipated it. Every financial deal passed through 3 rounds of legal review. Every supplier contract came with strict penalties and real-time monitoring. The woman who once crumbled behind closed doors now stood like a wall. And in this fortress, Felix stood beside her, not in front, not above. One night, after another long session finalizing their company's new security infrastructure, Ada turned to him and said softly, "Why haven't you walked away yet?" Felix, seated across from her, removed his glasses and replied, "Because my place is not beside power. It's beside purpose. And that purpose, Ada, is you." The trap for Ngozi was swift and silent. Felix's legal team had been quietly gathering every document tied to her failed bakery sabotage, her use of fake media influencers, and her connection to the food inspector scandal. It was a mountain of evidence, sealed, time-stamped, and court-admissible. Ngozi had no idea the woman she underestimated had been documenting every attack in real time. One morning, just as she boarded a private jet to Ghana, she was intercepted on the tarmac by EFCC agents. The internet exploded within hours. Socialite Ngozi nabbed in multi-million naira sabotage ring. Her photos, once seen on fashion covers, were now police mugshots. Her frozen bank accounts were broadcast on national TV. The empire she tried to build on Ada's ashes was shattered before her heels hit foreign soil. Ada didn't dance. She didn't smile. She simply walked into her office, pulled out her apron, and helped a new set of trainees knead dough. Linda, watching from afar, whispered to herself, "That's the Ada I once knew." With Ngozi's public fall, Ada's stock stabilized, public confidence returned, and her training centers for women saw a 60% increase in enrollment. She refused to give any interview. Instead, she released a single statement, "Let the bread speak." Across her branches, people returned not just for pastries, but for the story, the strength, the silence, the resilience of a woman who had been broken so many times, yet still rose like morning bread from warm dough. Meanwhile, Felix received a silent nod from Ada one evening as they stood on the company rooftop. No words, just a gesture of trust. It wasn't yet love, but it was trust. And for a woman who had suffered betrayal from every direction, it meant everything. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Ada stared ahead and said, "I'm not scared anymore." Felix replied quietly, "That's because you're finally wearing your crown." The bakery was unusually quiet that morning. The ovens hummed softly. The smell of warm butter and freshly baked bread hung in the air like a memory too sacred to touch. Ada stood alone in the kneading room, an apron tied over her neat white dress, her hands buried deep in dough, folding, pressing, turning. It was in this space, with her fingers stained and her forehead damp with honest sweat, that she found her clearest thoughts. She didn't need an office lined with glass or a title embossed on a door to feel powerful. This was her cathedral. This was her throne. She didn't hear Felix walk in. He had long learned to approach Ada without disrupting the peace she wrapped around herself like a shawl. He leaned against the door for a moment, just watching her, the same way one might admire a sunrise after the longest night of their life. He walked toward her slowly, his polished shoes stepping over scattered flour. Ada looked up, surprised, but didn't stop kneading. There was flour on her cheek and a smudge on her neck, but Felix saw nothing more beautiful. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. There was no velvet, no diamond sparkle, just simplicity. "You don't need someone to lead you," he said softly, setting the box down on the floured table beside her. "You've led armies without raising your voice. You've built from ashes, defended your name, protected your parents, trained others, and risen from betrayal after betrayal. I don't want to own your empire, Ada. I want to protect it. And you." She paused, her eyes flickering with vulnerability. Rare raw. Felix stepped closer. "Marry me. Not because I saved you, but because I never tried to rule you." Ada looked down at the ring, then at her dough, then back at the man who had carried her soul when her body failed. She didn't cry. Ada no longer cried out of fear. She looked at him steadily, her eyes damp but calm. She had trusted too quickly once, and paid the price in blood, fire, and betrayal. But Felix had waited, stood still through her storms, and never demanded entry. Only offered refuge. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Felix." She pulled the apron from her waist, wiped her hands clean, and extended her fingers. He slipped the ring on with a reverence that silenced even the clanging ovens. They didn't kiss. They simply held each other, quiet, surrounded by flour-dusted shelves, sunlight slicing through small windows, and the ghosts of everything they had both endured. It was the most sacred moment in Ada's life, and for once it didn't feel like victory. It felt like peace. In the weeks following the engagement, Ada began a restructuring of her empire, not just in policy, but in purpose. She had already survived sabotage, betrayal, media crucifixion, attempted murder, and heartbreak. What she built next wasn't just a company. It was a fortress. Each branch of her bakery was assigned not just operational staff, but community liaisons, young women trained in leadership, ethics, and customer care. Ada created bread that told stories, bread that carried weight, bread that remembered. On her flagship store walls, she hung portraits, not of herself, but of women she had trained. Widows, single mothers, ex-convicts, school dropouts, each one a pillar in her rebuilt vision. She launched the Flour for All initiative, opening affordable training centers where women could learn both baking and basic entrepreneurship. Felix handled the legal framework, helping to register the foundation that owned shares in the bakery, ensuring Ada would never again be the sole vulnerability. They met in strategy rooms at dawn over bowls of custard and cinnamon rolls, their fingers stained with ink and batter. But they laughed more now. Ada smiled more now. Her staff noticed it too, the softness returning to her steps, the grace in her once cautious touch. But she never forgot her past. She kept every betrayal locked in memory, not out of bitterness, but as blueprints of how to build better. "You're not building a bakery," Felix once said. "You're building a new way of life." And she was. From Lagos to Ibadan Enugu to Port Harcourt, her empire wasn't growing in numbers alone. It was growing in impact. She gave Linda a branch of her boutique idea, a chance to stand alone, without envy, competition, or shame. She located it in another city, gave her a clean space, and a clear warning. "Do not fight me. I won't fight you back. I will simply remove you from my life, this time permanently." Linda accepted the terms. She understood now. Ada wasn't weak. She wasn't that bread seller mocked on the roadside anymore. She was a woman who had bled without bitterness and built without blame. Ada visited the training centers often, baking with her girls, telling them stories of how the fire didn't burn her. It forged her. Her wedding preparations were simple, quiet. No magazines, no influencers, just lists, laughter, and plans. The queen hadn't just survived. She had earned her crown. Linda sat behind her boutique counter folding Ankara dresses when she saw the invitation envelope slide across the glass. She looked up, and the delivery girl simply nodded. No fanfare, no drama, Linda opened it slowly. Her eyes scanned the delicate script. You are invited to the wedding of Ada Obi and Felix Uche, with peace and gratitude. Linda didn't cry. She simply sighed. She had come full circle, from betrayer to betrayer's victim, from rival to savior, and now just a woman seeking peace. She wrote a short note and sent back a simple package, a soft scarf hand-sewn, the words "thank you" embroidered inside. She knew Ada would understand. No need for letters, explanations, or apologies. Some things didn't need to be fixed. They just needed to end well. Ada received the scarf during one of her early morning walks through her bakery. She smiled as she unfolded it, touching the fabric. No bitterness surfaced. She called Linda weeks later. I got your gift, she said. It was kind. Linda cleared her throat. I just didn't want to leave things broken. They were already broken, Linda, Ada replied gently. But not everything broken stays destroyed. Some things grow new. They met in person a week before the wedding. No media. No tears. Just coffee, soft laughter, and quiet acknowledgement of all they had lost and gained. Ada looked across the table and said, I'm not mad at you anymore. But I'll never let you close again. Linda nodded. That's fair. As Linda left that day, she looked back one last time at Ada's silhouette in the bakery's glass door. Strong, calm, unbothered. And she smiled, not out of defeat, but out of peace. They had both learned their lessons. They had both paid the price. And now they could live, not as friends, not as sisters, but as women who once walked through fire, and somehow didn't come out ashes. The sun had barely risen when the first wave of false headlines hit social media. Dozens of fake blogs began publishing coordinated stories claiming Ada's training centers were a front for financial fraud, that she had used government influence to squash competitors, and that she faked the kidnapping of her parents for sympathy. The posts were filled with heavily edited photos, anonymous whistleblowers, and concocted bank statements. At first, they seemed like digital noise, but by midday, they were trending on multiple platforms. It was Ngozi's final attack, her last attempt to break Ada from the shadows. Though she had gone into hiding, her network of corrupt influencers, digital mercenaries, and rogue PR agents had been waiting for this strike. They didn't come with knives this time, they came with lies. But Ada was no longer the same woman who once cried alone in the back of her bakery. For every fake headline, her legal team had a verified court ruling. For every edited bank slip, they had internal audits. And for every whisper of slander, Ada's media watchdog group posted real stories of widows turned entrepreneurs, ex-prisoners turned bakers, and orphans learning self-reliance. Felix had advised her months ago to invest in silent security, digital and physical. Now, her fortress stood ready. The PR team released a simple but powerful press statement titled, The Bread Still Rises. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was calm, layered with proof, and ended with Ada's signature and a closing line. You may attack the baker, but you'll never poison the bread. The impact was swift. Public sentiment shifted. Major newspapers denounced the smear campaign, and some of the fake bloggers were traced and arrested. Screenshots of bribes tied to Ngozi's last ally circulated online, exposing the corruption. Ada didn't celebrate. She didn't post quotes. She didn't gloat. She simply walked into her office, placed a stack of newspapers on the shelf beside her first bread certificate, and returned to work. That evening, as she supervised flour delivery at a local center, one of her girls, barely 18, asked, Ma, why do they always come for you? Ada smiled softly. Because I'm still standing. And some people hate to see a woman knead her way into power. Just as the shadows seemed to retreat, a fresh storm brewed, not from outside, but from within. A senior financial officer in charge of one of the regional branches was caught diverting funds through a fake packaging supplier. The discovery came only 2 weeks before Ada's wedding, during what should have been her most peaceful time. The books were a mess. Products had been tampered with. Staff were suddenly resigning. It felt like a crack in the dam. Ada called an emergency meeting, and the tension in the boardroom was thick enough to slice. The officer in question had fled, and the branch was in chaos. Whispers of sabotage echoed again. Ada listened to every report with a calm fury, not the shaking kind, but the steady fire that slowly clears a forest. Felix stepped in like a soldier. He led the legal audit, tracked the missing funds, froze relevant accounts, and shut down the supplier's connection across all branches. Within 72 hours, operations resumed under tighter controls. The media never got wind of the crisis. Felix ensured it was handled with surgical precision. Ada sat with her branch managers, not as a boss, but as a woman who had seen too much to pretend anymore. "This empire is not bread and butter," she told them. "It's blood. It's fire. And if you can't protect it, you don't belong here." Her words hit hard. Some resigned. Others vowed loyalty with tears. It was a needed purge, the final cleansing before peace could truly arrive. On the eve of her wedding, Ada walked alone in her headquarters, pausing in front of the room where she first started baking small loaves for street vendors. The smell was still there. The old oven. The rusted spoon that refused to break. She stood there, eyes closed, remembering the girl who once slept on flour sacks because the world gave her nothing. And now she had built everything. The storm had not passed, but it had bowed. And Ada? She had learned not just to rise, but to roar when needed. In her quietness lay strength. In her tears, steel. She didn't want a fairy tale wedding anymore. She wanted one that felt like her journey, stained with flour, kissed with sweat, and crowned with truth. The wedding was unlike any the city had seen, not because of glamour, but because of meaning. It was held in the heart of Ada's central training center, in a garden behind the bakery, where herbs were grown by trainees. Rows of wooden benches were placed beneath arching trees. The decor was simple, white cloth draped over trees, floral paths handmade by the trainees themselves, and a long walkway shaped like a bread loaf, symbolizing her journey. Ada wore a white gown embroidered with gold thread, but the hem bore gentle stains of flour, not by accident, but by choice. She didn't want to hide her origin. She wanted it to walk with her, into love, into tomorrow. Felix stood in a modest suit, no designer logos, no entourage. Just a man who had walked beside a queen before the crown was ever placed. As Ada approached the aisle, there was no music. Only soft humming from the trainees she had once taught to bake and sing. Some were orphans. Some were battered women. But today, they sang like angels. Ada's parents sat in the front row, alive, safe, and proud. Her father wept quietly, holding her mother's hand. And as Ada reached Felix, they didn't recite poems or vows rehearsed. Felix simply said, "You lead, Ada. I'll protect." And she whispered, "Then I'll never be afraid again." When the pastor finally said, "You may now kiss," they didn't. They embraced a long, silent embrace that needed no audience applause. That night, as the candles flickered and guests left, Ada sat on a bench beneath a jacaranda tree, her head resting on Felix's shoulder. No stoves, no shadows, just the scent of herbs, bread, and peace. "I thought peace came after the battle," she said softly. Felix replied, "Peace is what you bake from every scar." And together, they watched the stars, not as survivors, but as rulers of their destiny. The sun filtered gently through the canopy of jacaranda trees as the quiet reception continued beneath open skies. Ada and Felix walked together, hand in hand, surrounded by people who had seen their worst days and now rejoiced in their victory. Among the crowd, one figure stood out, not because of her dress, which was elegant but modest, or her jewelry, which was tastefully subtle. It was her presence, Linda. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't accompanied by bitterness, sarcasm, or rivalry. She came alone, invited but not expected. She wore soft lavender, a color that didn't beg for attention, but gently asked for peace. When she entered, Ada had paused for a moment, surprised, but did not frown. Instead, she gave a nod that meant, "It's okay now." Linda remained seated through the celebration, not drawing attention. She clapped gently when Ada gave her soft, unscripted speech to the young women in training. She smiled when Felix reached for Ada's hand as they cut the ceremonial flour cake made by the trainees, a simple, powerful moment. Linda remembered the days when she had been consumed by envy, when her goal was to surpass Ada, to destroy her light because she couldn't bear how it shone so purely. But time and pain had taught her what power really meant. Watching Ada now, not adorned in gold or diamonds, but dressed in flower and humility, surrounded by students and friends, made her realize she had been chasing illusions. And for the first time, she felt no hate, no longing, no regret, just peace. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and most guests had begun leaving, Ada approached Linda. No guards, no lawyer, no fear, just the woman she once called a friend. "Thank you for coming," Ada said quietly. Linda smiled. "Thank you for helping me build something of my own," she replied, referring to the boutique Ada had funded in another state, a return gesture for Linda's role in exposing Raymond. "I kept you at a distance for a reason," Ada admitted. "I know," Linda nodded. "And I stayed at a distance for the same reason." They didn't hug like best friends. They didn't cry or promise to rebuild what was broken. They simply shook hands, gently, like women who had gone through fire and walked away with wisdom. It was enough. Months had passed since the wedding, and Ada's life had entered a phase of quiet triumph. Not the kind broadcasted with hashtags or newspaper articles, but the kind that whispered in every smile she gave to her trainees, in the warm bread she served orphans on Saturdays, and in the way her eyes gleamed whenever Felix walked into the room. Her central training center had grown into a model for other communities, a place where poor widows, abused girls, abandoned boys, and struggling youths found not just skill, but dignity. There were no grand signboards or corporate show-offs, just the steady aroma of fresh bread, the comforting sounds of laughter and kneading, and the visible imprint of a woman who turned survival into legacy. On one quiet Thursday morning, Ada stood outside the training center as a new group of girls arrived. Some shy, some hardened by life, all carrying invisible pain. She greeted them personally, shaking each hand, remembering how far she had come. One girl, barely 16, stared at her with wide eyes. "Are you the owner?" she asked timidly. Ada knelt to her height and replied, "No, I'm the baker-in-chief. But this place belongs to all of us." She handed the girl a small loaf, still warm, and smiled. "This will be your first lesson. Never underestimate the power of what your hands can build." The girl clutched the bread with trembling fingers, and for a brief moment, Ada saw herself from long ago, lost, mocked, tired, and poor. But now she was the teacher. That evening, as she sat beneath the same jacaranda tree where she once wept and later married, Ada felt the kind of silence that didn't beg to be broken. Felix joined her, placing his coat over her shoulders without words. "Do you ever feel afraid it'll all vanish again?" she asked softly. He looked at her and answered, "No. Because now you're not just a survivor, Ada. You're a builder. You forged a crown not from gold, but from struggle, from scars, from flower-stained hands. And no one can steal what's baked into your soul." She smiled, leaning against him, her heart finally at rest. Behind them, the bakery glowed with light. In front of them, the world waited, and Ada, the bread seller once mocked, now walked as a queen crowned in humility, wisdom, and unshakable grace. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.